Death of William the Conqueror's daughter. May 27th, 1085, William the Conqueror's daughter was at Castle Acre in Norfolk, England. She was the wife of William de Warenne, a powerful Norman nobleman who had been granted vast estates for his loyalty during the invasion of England. That morning, Gundred had risen early, attending to household matters as she normally did. By midday, she was seated for a meal when attendants noticed a sudden change in her complexion. Within an hour, her skin had become flushed with fever. Physicians were summoned immediately, but what they found was baffling. Gundred's temperature rose with alarming speed. The heat from her skin could be felt without touching it. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, each exhale a struggle against the inferno building inside her body. Medical texts from the time describe a poisoning of the blood that could strike without warning. Modern doctors suspect typhus or a virulent strain of dysentery had infected her system. Whatever the cause, it worked with devastating efficiency. Her organs began to fail one by one, a cascade of internal collapse that no medieval medicine could halt. By evening, Gundred was delirious. Her body alternated between violent convulsions and moments of terrifying stillness. Attendants tried to cool her with damp cloths, but her fever only climbed higher. Her skin began to develop a mottled purple discoloration, starting at her extremities and moving inward. Witnesses reported that she remained conscious through much of the ordeal, her eyes open and aware as her body betrayed her. She could feel every moment of her system's rebellion. Blood began to seep from her nose and mouth, a sign that the infection had damaged her internal tissues beyond repair. Castle servants were kept at a distance, fearful that whatever struck her might spread. Only her husband and personal physician remained at her bedside. Just before midnight, after less than 12 hours of illness, Gundred's heart finally surrendered. The daughter of the man who conquered England could not conquer the invisible enemy within her own blood. End of King Henry I's nephew. On October 25th, 1154, the nephew of King Henry I of England lay writhing on a filthy pallet in a makeshift prison cell in Antioch. Stephen had joined the First Crusade with dreams of glory and conquest in the Holy Land. Instead, he found himself captured by enemy forces and held in conditions that would soon prove fatal. The Antioch prison was a breeding ground for disease. Human waste collected in corners, rats scurried freely across the stone floors, and prisoners shared a water source contaminated with sewage. For 3 days, Stephen had been drinking this water, each sip introducing deadly bacteria into his system. The first symptoms appeared suddenly. Severe abdominal cramps doubled him over in pain so intense that guards could hear his cries from outside the cell. Within hours, his body began to expel its contents violently. The dysentery that gripped him was particularly aggressive, a strain that attacked the intestinal lining with unusual ferocity. Medieval chroniclers described the scene in graphic detail. Stephen's body evacuated liquid waste almost continuously, quickly becoming streaked with blood as his intestines began to shed their protective lining. The dehydration was immediate and severe. His skin sunk into the hollows of his face, and his eyes receded into their sockets. Unlike some diseases that mercifully dull the senses, dysentery left Stephen fully conscious. He remained aware through every spasm, every evacuation, every moment of his body's betrayal. The nobleman who had dined at royal tables now lay in a pool of his own waste, unable to move away from it. Fellow prisoners watched helplessly as Stephen's lips cracked and bled from dehydration. His tongue swelled in his mouth, making speech impossible. The guards, fearing contagion, refused to enter the cell. No physician was summoned. No comfort was offered. 48 hours after the first cramp, Stephen's heart could no longer sustain itself against the massive fluid loss. His organs, starved of blood, shut down in rapid succession. The noble crusader died alone, drowning in the waste of his own disintegrating body. The agony of King John of England. On October 18, 1216, England's most reviled monarch lay dying at Newark Castle in Nottinghamshire. Just days earlier, John had been traveling with his royal entourage, fleeing rebel forces who had seized London. The king had been in good health, if poor spirits, as he moved northward through his increasingly hostile kingdom. During a feast at the bishop's palace in Lincoln, John consumed peaches and new cider. By morning, something had gone terribly wrong inside his body. The first attack came without warning, violent stomach cramps that left the king unable to mount his horse. His physicians noted his pallid complexion and the cold sweat that covered his skin. Within hours, John's body began to expel its contents from both ends. The dysentery that gripped him was particularly virulent, what medieval chroniclers called the bloody flux. His intestines were shedding their lining, sending streams of blood-tinged fluid from his body. Each evacuation was more violent than the last, leaving him weaker and more dehydrated. At Newark Castle, John was laid in a chamber that quickly became foul with the stench of illness. Servants were forced to constantly change his bedding as his body expelled liter after liter of bloody waste. The king's physicians attempted remedies, herbal concoctions, heated stones placed near his abdomen, bloodletting to balance his humors. Each intervention only weakened him further. John remained fully conscious through much of the ordeal. The man who had ruled England with an iron hand now couldn't control his own bodily functions. The pain was described as like hot knives twisting in the gut. His screams echoed through the castle corridors during the worst spasms. As October 18th dawned, John's organs began to fail. His kidneys shut down, toxins built in his bloodstream, and his heart struggled to pump blood through his dehydrated body. In his final moments, the king who had lost his empire, his crown jewels, and the respect of his subjects, lost the last battle against the microscopic invaders, destroying him from within. Death of Louis IX's son. On August 3, 1270, the son of King Louis IX of France woke in his tent outside Tunis with a strange pain in his armpit. John, whose name reflected his birth during the tragic Seventh Crusade in Damietta, had joined his father on yet another ill-fated expedition to the Holy Land. The Crusader camp sprawled across the North African coastline, thousands of European soldiers packed together in sweltering heat. By midday, the pain had intensified. A small hard lump had formed where the discomfort began. Medieval physicians called these swellings buboes, though they didn't understand their significance. John's personal doctor examined the growth with concern but assured the prince it was likely a minor infection from the harsh conditions. Within hours, the truth became horrifyingly clear. The lump grew rapidly, turning an angry purple-black as it swelled to the size of an egg. Similar buboes appeared in John's groin and neck, each one more painful than the last. His skin burned with fever, reaching temperatures so high that attendants couldn't keep their hands on his flesh for more than a few seconds. The plague had entered the Crusader camp. What modern scientists would later identify as Yersinia pestis was multiplying exponentially in John's lymphatic system. The bacteria released toxins that triggered a systemic inflammatory response, causing his blood vessels to leak and clot simultaneously. By evening, black patches appeared on John's extremities as small blood vessels ruptured beneath his skin. His breathing became labored. Each inhalation was a desperate gasp as his lungs filled with fluid. Despite the agony, he remained conscious, his eyes wide with terror as he watched his own body turn against him. King Louis was summoned to his son's tent, but quarantine measures kept him at a distance. The camp fell silent as word spread of the prince's condition. Other soldiers began checking their own bodies for similar swellings. In the early hours of August 4th, less than 24 hours after the first symptom appeared, John Tristan's organs failed in rapid succession. Blood pooled in his tissues, oxygen couldn't reach his brain, and his heart finally surrendered to the bacterial siege. End of the Italian poet Giovanni. On December 21, 1375, the celebrated Italian author of the Decameron sat propped up on pillows in his modest home in Curtaldo. Boccaccio, who had famously chronicled the horrors of the Black Death, was now facing his own medical nightmare. For months, the writer had been fighting a mysterious wasting illness that consumed his body from within. Visitors who had known Boccaccio in his prime barely recognized the skeletal figure before them. His once robust frame had withered, the skin hanging loose on his bones like a garment several sizes too large. What modern doctors would likely diagnose as tuberculosis or a chronic gastrointestinal disease had been methodically destroying his tissues for over a year. The deterioration followed a cruel pattern. Each morning, Boccaccio would wake drenched in sweat, his nightclothes soaked through despite the winter chill. By midday, a fever would take hold, climbing steadily until his mind clouded. Evenings brought the racking cough that tore his lungs and brought up blood-streaked phlegm that he carefully concealed from visitors. Unlike the plague he had documented, which killed within days, Boccaccio's illness took its time. Each week saw another small capability lost. First, his regular walks through Certaldo became impossible. Then, writing for more than a few minutes exhausted him. Finally, even sitting upright required assistance. The writer's fingers, once capable of producing some of Italy's most magnificent prose, had become twisted and swollen. His breath came in shallow gasps that never satisfied his lungs' demand for air. Each inhalation triggered spasms of coughing that left him exhausted. Most distressing for the great observer of humanity was watching his own decline with perfect clarity. The disease had not dulled his mind. Boccaccio documented his symptoms with the same precision he had used to describe the plague decades earlier. On that December evening, as darkness fell over Certaldo, Boccaccio's body finally surrendered. A violent coughing fit ruptured weakened blood vessels in his lungs. He choked on his own blood, unable to clear his airway, conscious until the very end as he suffocated within sight of his greatest works lining the shelves around him. The Last Breath of King Henry V. On August 31st, 1422, England's warrior the king lay dying at the Château de Vincennes, near Paris. Henry, the victor of Agincourt and conqueror of much of France, had been besieging the city of Meaux when the first symptoms appeared. The 35-year-old monarch had seemed invincible on the battlefield, but the microscopic enemy invading his body would prove unstoppable. The dysentery began suddenly during a war council meeting. Henry excused himself as cramps twisted his intestines, a burning sensation spreading through his abdomen. Within hours, his body was expelling liquid waste with alarming frequency. Each evacuation was more violent than the last, quickly becoming streaked with blood as the infection ravaged his intestinal lining. Royal physicians applied standard treatments, herbal compresses on the stomach, bloodletting to balance his humors, and various potions meant to bind the bowels. These medieval remedies not only failed to help, but likely hastened his decline. The bloodletting further weakened an already dehydrated body, while the binding agents trapped toxins that should have been expelled. By the third day, Henry could no longer rise from his bed. The sheets beneath him had to be changed hourly, soaked through with blood-tinged fluid and sweat. The man who had commanded thousands on the battlefield couldn't command his own bodily functions. Courtiers winced at the stench that filled the royal chamber, a smell so foul that chroniclers mentioned it specifically in their accounts. Henry remained lucid through much of his ordeal, aware of the cruel irony of his situation. The king who survived arrow wounds at Shrewsbury and led charges against French knights was being destroyed by an invisible enemy. His lips cracked from dehydration, his tongue swelled, and his eyes sank into their sockets as his body consumed itself from within. On the evening of August 31st, after a week of suffering, Henry's organs began to shut down in sequence. His kidneys failed first, then his liver. Toxins built up in his bloodstream, causing his extremities to turn black. The king who had united England and France under one crown took his final breath as infection overwhelmed his heart, his body unrecognizable from the warrior it had once been. The last illness of King Henry IV. On March 20th, 1413, England's first Lancastrian king drew his final breath in the Jerusalem chamber at Westminster Abbey. Henry had seized the throne 14 years earlier, but for the last decade of his life, a mysterious illness had been seizing him in return. What began as occasional fainting spells had transformed into a constellation of horrifying symptoms that medieval medicine could neither explain nor treat. The progression was merciless and methodical. First came the skin lesions, crusty, oozing patches that appeared without warning on his face and hands. Court physicians applied poultices of herbs and animal fat, but the lesions spread, creating a mask-like appearance that made courtiers recoil. The skin around these wounds would flake away, leaving raw, weeping tissue exposed to the air. Then came the seizures. Without warning, the king's body would stiffen, his back arching unnaturally as his limbs thrashed against invisible restraints. Foam would bubble from his lips, sometimes tinged with blood where he had bitten through his tongue. Each episode left him weaker, his mind cloudier, his speech more slurred. Modern doctors suspect epilepsy, possibly triggered by a brain lesion or advanced syphilis. By the winter of 1413, Henry could no longer appear in public. The man who had overthrown a king was now confined to darkened chambers, his body emaciated, his once commanding voice reduced to a whisper. Court proceedings continued without him, decisions made in his name by advisors who rarely saw him. The smell from his deteriorating flesh became so offensive that even his most loyal attendants could only stay in his presence for short periods. Most disturbing was Henry's awareness throughout his decline. Between seizures, his mind remained sharp enough to understand what was happening to him. He recognized the fear in his servants' eyes, the careful way they avoided touching his diseased skin, the hushed conversations that stopped when he entered a room. On that March evening, as candles illuminated the Jerusalem chamber, Henry asked to be positioned facing the altar. A particularly violent seizure gripped him, lasting longer than any before. When it finally released him, the king's heart had been strained beyond its limits. The usurper who had lived by force died by it, his body convulsing one final time before falling still. Death of the Black Prince. On June 8, 1376, Edward of Woodstock, heir to the English throne and military hero of the 100 Years' War, lay dying at the Palace of Westminster in London. For nearly a decade, the prince who had never lost a battle had been fighting an enemy he couldn't defeat. What began as occasional stomach pains after the Spanish campaign of 1367 had developed into a relentless, wasting illness that medieval medicine had no answer for. The dysentery that gripped him was unlike the acute form that killed victims within days. This was a chronic amoebic infection that worked with methodical slowness, destroying his intestines millimeter by millimeter. Each day brought the same ritual of pain and humiliation. His mornings began with violent expulsions of bloody waste, leaving him exhausted before the day had properly begun. By 1371, the prince could no longer ride a horse. The man who had charged across the field at Crécy now unable to bear the motion without excruciating pain. His legs swelled with edema, the fluid buildup stretching his skin until it shone. When physicians pierced the skin to drain the fluid, the relief was temporary, and the wounds often became infected, adding new torments to his condition. The prince's body betrayed him in stages. First came the uncontrollable evacuations, then the swelling, followed by a yellowing of his skin and eyes as his liver began to fail. Most cruel was the preservation of his mind throughout the ordeal. The strategist who had outthought the French at Poitiers could still think clearly enough to understand exactly what was happening to his body. Courtiers who visited were shocked by his transformation. The once robust warrior had become a skeleton with skin stretched over it, his famous black armor hanging unworn in the corner of his chamber. The smell that surrounded him was so overpowering that even longtime servants struggled to remain in his presence. In his final hours, the prince developed a fever that climbed relentlessly. His breathing became shallow and rapid as his body made its last stand against the infection that had consumed it from within. The greatest English warrior of his age died not in glorious battle, but in soiled bedsheets. His once powerful body wasted to nothing by microscopic invaders that worked with more precision than any enemy archer.